The pen moved before the Duke registered whose hand held it. Charles Ashwell stood in the doorway of the back office at Caulfield & Sons on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1815, and the woman sitting in the publisher's leather chair was his wife. Beatrix did not look up. She was signing her name at the bottom of a 5-year printing contract, and the scratch of her nib against the paper was the loudest sound in the room. The publisher, a thin, careful man named Caulfield, sat across the desk with his hands folded and his spectacles pushed to the top of his head. 2 clerks stood against the bookcase with their ledgers closed. The Duke's solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, had gone very still beside the door. For 7 years, the Duke of Ashwell had not spoken a word to this woman at supper. For the last 3, the silence had spread beyond the table to every room and corridor of the house. She sat at the far end of his table, below the steward, below the housekeeper, in the chair reserved for guests of no consequence, and the visiting peers who glanced down the table at her and glanced away assumed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a printer's daughter purchased to settle a debt, kept out of charity, worth nothing. "Sir," Caulfield said, addressing the Duke with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment, "Mrs. Greville has been the author since the first volume in 1808. Henry Greville." The name behind the naval adventure novels that had sold 14,000 copies in 3 years, that sat in every subscription library in England, that the Prince Regent was rumoured to read before bed. Charles had seen the volumes in George's study. George had bought the first one the year before the accident. Beatrix finished her signature. She set the pen in the inkstand. She lifted her eyes to the Duke for the first time in 3 years, and her face held the composure of a woman who had practiced silence the way other women practice piano. "You may sit down, Your Grace," she said. "You owe me approximately £17,400. The solicitor pulled out the second chair. Charles sat down without speaking, and the clock on Caulfield's mantel ticked 3 times into the silence of a marriage that had just changed its terms. 7 years earlier, Beatrix Lange had been a printer's daughter in Southwark, with ink under her fingernails and a father who owed the crown more than he could pay. Edmund Lange printed pamphlets. He printed them cheaply, he printed them for anyone who paid, and in the autumn of 1807 he printed one that named a magistrate's wife as a debtor and a liar, in language the courts could not overlook. The magistrate filed a libel suit. The Crown backed it. Edmund owed £1,100 in damages by Christmas, and his press was seized by January. He had one remaining asset. His daughter was 22, well-read, and by the desperate arithmetic of a ruined man, marriageable to anyone willing to absorb the debt. The Duke of Ashwell needed a wife, not because he wanted one, but because his steward had informed him that the estate required an heir, and the family solicitor had reminded him that the Crown preferred a married duke when distributing forestry grants. Charles was 29, 7 years into a title that should have been George's, and still treated by the ton as a temporary occupant of a chair that belonged to his dead brother. George had been the Duke before him. George had run Ashwell brilliantly. He managed the timber revenues, expanded the tenant farms, rebuilt the East Wing with his own architectural drawings, hosted county assemblies that the neighbouring gentry spoke about for months afterward. Then a horse threw him during a November hunt, and his neck broke against a stone wall, and Charles inherited everything at 22, with no preparation, and a grief so private he kept it from every soul alive. The marriage was transactional. Edmund Lange offered his daughter. The Duke absorbed the libel debt. No courtship, no correspondence. Beatrix arrived at Ashwell Hall in February of 1808 with 2 trunks and a writing case, and the understanding that she was a line item in a legal settlement. She was seated at the far end of the dining table on her first evening. Not beside the Duke, not in the middle. At the foot, past the steward Mr. Fenton, past the housekeeper Mrs. Collier, in the chair the household used for visiting clergymen who had overstayed their welcome. Agnes, the maid assigned to her, set a napkin at her place with a look that said everything a servant is not permitted to say aloud. Beatrix ate in silence, watching her husband at the head of the table, 30 feet of polished oak between them, and understood. She was not a wife. She was a receipt. The Duke's aunt, Lady Honoria Ashwell, arrived from London 3 weeks later. Lady Honoria was 61, had outlived 2 husbands, and rebuilt a third fortune from the wreckage of the first 2, and carried herself with the blunt authority of a woman who had stopped asking permission around the time of the American War. She took one look at the seating arrangement at supper and turned to her nephew, with the expression of a woman locating a stain on good linen. "Where have you put her, Charles?" Charles said nothing. Lady Honoria looked down the table at Beatrix, who was eating her soup with the composure of someone who had decided, quietly and completely, to deny this household the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Lady Honoria filed the observation in the part of her mind where she kept debts she intended to collect later. "That girl," she told Agnes the following morning, "has more steel in her than my nephew has in his entire disposition. Watch her." Agnes watched her closely. She brushed Beatrix's hair each night and waited for her to cry. Beatrix stayed dry-eyed, in front of Agnes, in the corridors, in the dining room, always. But Agnes slept in the room next to the former linen closet on the 3rd floor, and on certain nights she heard the scratch of a pen that continued until dawn. Once, in the terrible March of 1812, when the harvest had failed and the estate account was overdrawn, she heard through the wall a sound that was unmistakably a sob, quickly smothered, as if the woman making it had pressed her own hand over her mouth. Beatrix began writing in her first week at Ashwell. The room she chose was the 3rd floor linen closet, barely large enough for a desk and a chair, with a single window that faced the orchard. She wrote by candlelight after supper, when the household believed she was sleeping. She wrote in a hand she had practiced since girlhood, fast and clean, with the margins her father had taught her to leave for the compositor. She wrote a naval adventure about a captain named Henry Greville, who sailed from Portsmouth to the Barbary coast and back in 240 pages of direct prose that drew on every Admiralty report in the Ashwell Library. She posted the manuscript to Caulfield and Sons in London under a male name. She asked for payment to be sent to an account at Hawes Bank in the name of H. Greville, and she requested that all correspondence be directed to a post office box in the village rather than to the Hall. The first volume sold 900 copies. The second sold 2,000. By the 3rd year, Henry Greville was one of the most popular adventure writers in England, and the royalties were quietly transferred from Hawes to the estate account that Mr. Pemberton managed from London. Pemberton believed the money was a Crown Forestry grant. The Duke believed Pemberton. The roof was repaired, the tenants were paid, the east wing plaster that George had designed was maintained, and Beatrix continued to eat at the foot of the table, 30 feet from a husband who had never once asked how his estate remained solvent. When Lord and Lady Denton visited for the autumn shoot in 1813, Lady Denton looked down the table at Beatrix, who was wearing the same grey dress she had worn at the previous visit, and looked at her husband with a raised eyebrow. Lord Denton said nothing, because there was nothing useful a man could say about another man's household. But at breakfast the following morning, Lady Denton sat beside Beatrix and asked her opinion of the weather, and Beatrix answered with such quiet precision about the state of the barley harvest and the drainage problems on the south field that Lady Denton told Lord Denton in the carriage home that the Duke's wife was the most interesting person in that house and the most insulted. By the spring of 1815, Beatrix had published 14 Henry Greville novels. The estate was solvent. Her husband had not spoken her name in 3 years, and then his solicitor wrote to say he needed to come to London to meet the author whose contract was keeping Ashwell alive. In the publisher's office, the silence held long enough for one of the clerks to shift his weight and the floorboard to creak beneath him. Charles looked at the contract on Caulfield's desk. Beatrix's signature was unhesitant at the bottom. Beside it, Caulfield's countersignature and the date. "How long?" he said. 7 years. Since the first volume. He looked at the contract again, then back at her face. The forestry grant. There is no forestry grant worth the name. The Crown approved £400 over 6 years. The rest came from me. Mr. Pemberton received the funds through Hawes Bank in quarterly instalments. I told him it was Crown revenue dispersed through the bank, and the sums arrived steadily enough that he had no reason to question the source. Caulfield folded his hands. The new contract is for 5 years. 6 novels. The advance alone is £4,000. I'd expected to negotiate with Mr. Greville directly. "I was the only person you were ever going to negotiate with," Beatrix said. She was looking at the Duke with the composure of a woman who had learned to hold her face still the way a mason holds a wall, by practice and by will. Charles felt the floor shift beneath him. Not guilt, not yet, something older. The sensation of standing on hollow ground. He had believed he was managing Ashwell. He had believed the grant proved the Crown saw competence in him. He had believed, and this was what cut deepest, that he was finally doing what George would have done. George would have noticed. George would have looked down that table and seen his wife. "I will review the contract with Pemberton," Charles said, and stood and walked out of the room without looking at her. The door closed behind him, and his footsteps faded down the staircase. Beatrix closed her eyes, and the composure that had held for 3 years cracked enough for Caulfield to see her shoulders tremble once before she steadied them. "The contract," she said, "is it binding?" "Fully." She opened her eyes. She took her copy, folded it into her writing case, and walked out of Caulfield's office into the April sun. She stood on Piccadilly for a long moment, letting the noise of the street wash over her. Carriages passed and a boy called newspapers from the corner, and the city moved around her with the indifference of a world that knew nothing about the contract in her writing case, or the 7 years of silence it had just shattered. She had carried the secret so long that setting it down felt less like relief than like the hollow lightness of a woman whose body has forgotten the shape of standing without a burden. Her throat ached, her eyes burned. She pressed her hands flat against her skirt and held them there until the trembling stopped. They returned to Ashwell on separate coaches. Charles left London within the hour. Beatrix took a room at a hotel off the Strand and sat alone with the writing case on the bed and the April light coming grey through the window, wondering whether the man who had walked out of Caulfield's office without looking at her would speak to her when she arrived home, or whether the silence would simply find a new shape. She arrived at Ashwell the following afternoon. That evening, for the first time in 3 years, the Duke spoke at supper. "Mrs. Ashwell will be seated at the centre of the table from this evening forward." Mr. Fenton moved the setting without a word. Agnes, standing in the kitchen passage, pressed her hand to the doorframe and breathed. Beatrix took the new chair and ate in silence. She did not look at the Duke, and his eyes stayed on his plate, but the 30 feet of oak between them had been halved, and every servant in the room registered the change. The next morning Charles went to the library. On a shelf beside George's architectural volumes he found 14 unread books. All of them were Henry Greville novels, shelved in order of publication by someone with access to the library, who knew exactly where George's favourite section ended. He pulled out the first, The Naval Fortunes of Captain Dowell. He opened it to the dedication page and read the inscription, "For the house that stands." He closed the book, then opened it again and read the inscription a second time, and the 4 words sat in his chest like a stone, because the house that stood was the house he had believed he was holding up, and the woman who had written the dedication was the woman he had seated at the foot of his table and forgotten. He sat down in George's reading chair and read the novel from the first page to the last without standing. The prose was clean and direct. The naval details were precise enough that she must have read every Admiralty report in the collection. The characters were drawn with a clarity that unsettled him, because the captain's first officer, a quiet, overlooked man who repaired the hull alone at night while the rest of the crew slept, who kept the ship's accounts, and who bore the captain's inattention without a word of complaint, read like a portrait he recognized. He read the second novel that afternoon, and the third that night, and each one cut deeper than the last. The first officer appeared in every book, sometimes as a navigator, sometimes as a surgeon, once as a harbour pilot who guided ships through fog by listening to the way the water broke against the quay. In every version, Charles recognized the same quiet, capable man, drawn with a clarity and a tenderness that made something in his chest tighten until he had to set the book down and breathe. By the end of the week, he had finished all 14, and he understood 2 things. His wife was a finer writer than anyone he had ever met, and she had built a portrait of him across 14 books that was more honest than any mirror he had looked into. She had seen him. She had always seen him, and he had been sitting 30 feet away, looking at the wrong end of the table. He said nothing about the novels, but the following Monday he walked into the morning room where Beatrix was writing, openly now, at the desk in daylight, and set a cup of tea beside her manuscript without speaking. She looked at the cup, then at him, but he was already turning away. "Thank you," she said to his back. He paused in the doorway long enough to nod once, and then he was gone. Agnes saw this from the passage and told Mr. Fenton that evening. Fenton said nothing, but the next morning the morning-room fire was laid for the first time in 4 years. Lady Honoria, who had returned from London the previous week for reasons she described as seasonal, and Agnes suspected were strategic, observed all of this from the window seat of the upstairs sitting-room, where she had a clear view of the morning-room door. "He brought her tea," she said to Agnes that afternoon. "Yes, my lady." "Unprompted?" "Yes." "Good. That is the first sensible thing he has done since he inherited." She paused. "If he undoes it, tell me immediately." The thaw was real, but it was fragile, and it was about to be tested. Lady Margot Vane arrived at Ashwell Hall 3 weeks after the Duke and Duchess returned from London. She was the widow of Sir Philip Vane, whose estate bordered the Duke's to the south. She was 34, handsome, well-connected, and she had spent the last 2 years making it understood in every drawing-room in the county that she considered the Duke of Ashwell a suitable second husband and his current wife a negligible obstacle. She arrived on a Thursday with her maid, a trunk of evening clothes, and a confidence that occupied more space than both. "I have taken the liberty of arranging a spring assembly at the Hall," she told the Duke at supper. "The invitations went out last week. 40 guests. One cannot leave these things to the household." Charles looked at her. He looked at Beatrix, who was eating her supper in her new seat at the centre of the table, with the composure she had worn for 7 years. "This is the first I have heard of it," he said. "I handled everything," Lady Margot said. She smiled at Beatrix the way one smiles at a piece of furniture that has not yet been moved out of the room. Beatrix set down her fork. "How kind of you, Lady Vane. I look forward to the evening." The table heard it. Lady Honoria, seated at the Duke's left, tilted her head and said nothing. After supper, Lady Margot found Beatrix alone in the entrance hall and spoke in a voice low enough for privacy, but loud enough for the 2 footmen standing at the door. "I hope you will not exert yourself with the arrangements, Mrs. Ashwell. These events require a hostess of a certain standing. A printer's daughter can hardly be expected to manage the guest list for a Duke's assembly." The footman looked at the floor. Beatrix looked at Lady Margot. "You are very considerate." Lady Margot walked away. Beatrix stood in the hall, composure intact, because 7 years of silence had taught her that the only armour available to a woman without standing was the refusal to show she had been cut. But later, when the house was quiet and the servants had gone to bed, Beatrix climbed the stairs to the linen closet and sat at her desk and pressed her fingers hard against her closed eyes. The tears came, hot and furious, and she let them fall in the dark, where they belonged to her alone. Her chest ached with the weight of holding composure for so long, and her hands shook against her face, and she breathed in ragged pulls that sounded too loud in the small room. She was angry. That was the part that surprised her, the sharpness of it, because beneath the hurt and beneath the weariness anger sat like a coal, steady and unsurprised and old. She had built this house. She had kept it warm and solvent and standing. She had written through fevers and grief and the long winters when the estate accounts ran thin, and only her pen kept the creditors at bay and the tenants fed. And the woman downstairs, the woman in the blue dress with the easy smile, had called her the printer's girl and meant it as a final word on everything Beatrix was worth. She cried until the candle guttered and the room went dark, and then she dried her face and lit a new candle and opened her manuscript and wrote, because writing was what she did when the world tried to make her small, and it had always been enough. Agnes heard her through the wall, both the crying and the writing that followed. She left a cup of tea outside the door without knocking. When she came back an hour later, the cup was empty and the pen was still moving, and Agnes stood in the corridor and thought about the kind of woman who could weep and work in the same hour and keep both private, and she understood something about Beatrix that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The following afternoon, Charles found Beatrix in the orchard. She was walking alone. He fell into step beside her without invitation. "Lady Vane spoke to you last evening," he said. "She did." "What did she say?" Beatrix walked 3 more steps before answering. "The same things people always say." Charles stopped walking. "Beatrix." The sound of her own name, spoken aloud in his voice, landed in her chest like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. She stopped and turned to face him. It was the first time he had used her name since the publisher's office, and hearing it spoken in the open air of the orchard, under the apple trees she had walked beneath alone for 7 years, made something shift inside her that she was entirely unprepared for. She felt her eyes sting and blinked it away before he could see. "What did she say to you?" Beatrix held his gaze. "She said a printer's daughter cannot be expected to manage a guest list. She said it in the entrance hall, in front of your footmen, who stood and looked at the floor because they knew it was wrong and lacked the rank to say so." Something moved across his face, something colder than anger, and more considered, the expression of a man recalculating what he had permitted under his own roof. "She will not say it again," he said, and the way he said it, quiet and level and certain, was the first time Beatrix had heard the Duke of Ashwell sound like a man who intended to use his title for something that mattered. That evening at supper, with Lady Margot present and Lady Honoria watching from across the table, the Duke addressed the room. "The spring assembly will be hosted by the Duchess of Ashwell. All arrangements will be made through her. Any guest who finds this unsatisfactory is welcome to decline the invitation." Lady Margot's spoon paused over her soup. Lady Honoria lifted her glass very slightly in Beatrix's direction. Beatrix looked at her husband, and for one unguarded moment their eyes met, and what she saw was something beyond pity or guilt, something entirely unexpected: recognition. Then he looked away, and the moment closed, and the supper continued. But after the candles were snuffed and the household retired, Agnes heard footsteps on the 3rd floor. The Duke's footsteps, pausing outside the linen closet where Beatrix wrote, and then retreating without a knock. He had come to her door. He had not been able to go in. 3 days before the assembly, Mr. Pemberton arrived from London with a leather case under his arm, and asked to speak to the Duke in private. Charles took him to the study. Pemberton opened the case and spread 7 years of ledger sheets across the desk. "I have completed the full audit you requested," he said. "The total sum transferred from the Henry Greville account to Ashwell's estate fund between 1808 and 1815 is £23,112. Mrs. Ashwell estimated 17,000 at the publisher's office, but she was tracking only her royalty payments. The full sum includes interest, reinvestment proceeds, and advance payments she arranged through the bank." Charles looked at the numbers. Bank transfers, publishing contracts, correspondence with Hawes Bank, royalty statements from Caulfield and Sons, 7 years of labour, recorded in careful columns. "The Crown Forestry Grant," Pemberton continued, "was approved in 1809. Its total value over 6 years was £420. The difference between what the estate received and what the Crown provided was generated entirely by your wife." Charles sat down. "There is more." Pemberton drew out a separate folder. "I found correspondence in the Hawes files from the winter of 1812. When the harvest failed and the estate account was overdrawn, Mrs. Ashwell wrote to the bank directly. She instructed them to advance her royalties against 2 novels still unwritten. She produced both manuscripts in 14 weeks to meet the bank's repayment deadline. During those weeks, the staff wages, the tenant rents, and the East Wing repairs were paid on time. She did not miss a single payment." Charles pressed his hand across his eyes. Everything he had believed about himself, about his stewardship, about the ground he stood on was a fiction. The Crown's recognition was a fantasy, his stewardship an illusion. The estate that George built was standing because Beatrix had held it up with her pen, alone, in the dark, for 7 years, while he sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. "The autumn tenancy renewal in 1813, Pemberton said quietly. "The livestock purchase in 14, the chapel roof last winter. All of it was her." "Does she know you are telling me this?" "No, but she made no effort to conceal the records. I believe she expected you would look eventually." Charles stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the east wing that George had designed and Beatrix had paid for, and he stayed there for a long time without speaking. That evening, he went to find her. Beatrix was in the morning room, writing by lamplight. The supper tray Agnes had left sat untouched beside her elbow. She looked up when he came in, and the careful attention in her face was the look of a woman who had learned to read rooms the way sailors read weather, quickly, because the cost of misreading was high. Charles sat in the chair across from her desk. He was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet, because she understood silence better than anyone in the house. "George was the Duke," he said at last. "I was the second son. I spent my entire youth standing behind him, watching him manage the tenants, watching him draw the plans for the East Wing, watching him walk the fields and know every man by name. I learned nothing about the running of this place, because I was certain I would never need to. He was 7 years older. He was supposed to outlive me by decades." Beatrix set her pen in the inkstand and folded her hands and listened. "When the horse threw him, I was 22. I inherited everything in a single afternoon. The title, the tenants, the debts, the plaster he designed, the east wing he drew with his own hand. I walked through this house for months, feeling as though I had broken into another man's home and been told to live there. Every room was his. Every decision I made felt like a trespass against his memory." He looked at his hands. They rested on his knees, and the effort of holding them steady was visible in his wrists. "Every year since, I waited for Pemberton to write and tell me it was finished. Every quarter I expected the accounts to collapse. Every harvest I walked the fields and counted what I was losing. And then the money appeared in the accounts, and I told myself the Crown had looked at my work and seen something worth preserving. I told myself I was managing, that I was finally doing what George would have done." His voice roughened on the name, and he paused, and the pause lasted long enough for the lamp to gutter once and steady itself. "It was you. It was you the entire time. And I was so consumed with proving I was fit for a dead man's chair that I failed to see the woman who was actually keeping the house alive, who was sitting at my table every evening with ink on her fingers and the full weight of my family's future on her shoulders, and I treated her as though she were part of the furniture." The room was quiet. Outside, a wood pigeon called from the orchard, and the evening light lay long and thin across the floor. "George would have been proud of you," Beatrix said. "You cannot know that." "I can. There are letters in the bottom drawer of the study, the ones you have never opened because you were afraid of disturbing his things. He wrote to your mother about you. He said you were steadier than you believed, and that the estate would be safe in your hands." She paused. "He used that word. Safe." Charles looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not the cold mask, and not the formal courtesy, but the slow, difficult opening of a man who has been holding a door shut since the day his brother died, and has just been told he is allowed to let go. His eyes were bright, and he blinked and looked away, and when he looked back, he was steadier. "Why did you keep silent all those years?" "Because telling a man he is better than he believes is useless until he is ready to hear it, and because I had my own work to do, and I chose to do it rather than wait for someone to give me permission." She reached across the desk and laid her hand on his. He turned his palm upward and held on, and they sat together in the lamplight, while the supper tray cooled and the day settled and the house grew quiet around them. It was the first time they had touched since their wedding, and neither of them let go. Agnes found them an hour later when she came to collect the tray. She saw their hands linked across the desk and the lamplight steady between them, and she backed out of the doorway without a sound and went downstairs and told Mr. Fenton that something had changed in the house. Fenton looked at her for a moment and said he knew, because he had laid the morning room fire himself that day, and the Duke had carried in a second chair. The assembly was held on a Saturday evening, and 40 guests filled the East Wing gallery. Lord and Lady Denton, Sir Geoffrey Reed, the county magistrate, the neighbouring families, Mr. Caulfield, the publisher, who had been visiting a country client nearby and received an invitation from Lady Margot herself. She knew nothing of his profession, having simply invited every gentleman of standing within 20 miles, because she wanted an audience for the evening she intended to host as the unofficial mistress of Ashwell Hall. Lady Honoria arrived in a dark green dress and took a chair near the window with a view of the entire room. She had told Agnes that morning that she intended to give this evening her full attention. The candles were lit and the musicians played, and Lady Margot stood at the Duke's right hand to receive guests as if the position were already hers, and Beatrix stood at the edge of the gallery in a cream gown, watching. The evening proceeded through supper and into the dancing. At 10:30, with the gallery full and the guests settled, the Duke stepped forward and the room quieted, conversations dying along the table like candles blown out one by one. Mr. Fenton, standing at the sideboard, straightened. "I have an announcement," Charles said. "It concerns my wife." Lady Margot's smile thinned. "Many of you know the novels of Henry Greville, the Naval Adventures, 14 volumes, sold in every subscription library in England." Nods around the room. Lord Denton leaned forward. "Henry Greville is a pseudonym. The author's real name is Beatrix Ashwell, my wife. She has been writing these novels since 1808, and the income from those novels, every shilling of it, has been directed into the Ashwell estate accounts for the past 7 years." Silence. Complete, pressing silence. The kind that fills a room like water. Lady Denton's hand went to her mouth. Sir Geoffrey set down his glass. Caulfield, seated near the end of the table, folded his hands and nodded once, a confirmation the room registered immediately. "The total sum," Charles said, "is £23,112. Someone drew breath sharply. The curate, or perhaps it was everyone. "This estate, the roof over your heads this evening, the wages of every tenant and servant, the repairs to the east wing, the livestock, the plaster my brother George designed, stands because of her, not because of a crown grant, not because of my management, because Beatrix sat in a room on the 3rd floor of this house every night for 7 years and wrote novels that kept us all alive." He paused, "and I was blind to it, because I refused to look." He turned to Beatrix. The gallery watched. Lady Margot stood. Her chair scraped the floor. "This is absurd." Her voice was pitched to carry, and it carried. "A printer's daughter writing naval adventures under a man's name. I've never heard anything so unlikely. Where is the proof? Anyone could claim authorship of another person's work." The gallery held its breath. Beatrix rose. She looked at Lady Margot across the room with the composure of a woman who had eaten at the foot of this table for 7 years, and kept her voice level through all of it. "Mr. Caulfield, would you read the inscription on the contract?" Caulfield opened his leather case and drew out the 5-year printing contract. He read it aloud. "This agreement between Caulfield and Sons, publishers, and Beatrix Ashwell, writing as Henry Greville, for the exclusive publication of 6 novels, signed in the presence of 2 witnesses on the 14th of April, 1815. "The handwriting sample," Beatrix said. Caulfield produced a second sheet, a page of manuscript in Beatrix's hand, the opening paragraph of the first Henry Greville novel. He set it on the table beside a letter from Beatrix that Pemberton had brought from the Hawes Bank correspondence. The handwriting was identical. Every guest near enough to see leaned forward. "I also hold," Pemberton said, standing, 7 years of bank transfer records from Hawes, documenting every movement of funds from the Henry Greville publishing account to the Ashwell estate account. Every entry is initiated and countersigned by Mrs. Ashwell." Lady Margot looked at the contract, at the manuscript page, at the bank records laid across the white linen. The colour left her face in stages. "In the winter of 1812, Beatrix said, and her voice was steady, "when the harvest failed and the estate account was overdrawn, I wrote 2 complete novels in 14 weeks to cover the shortfall. I can recite from memory the opening line of every Greville novel, name every character, describe every plot from outline to final page, and produce the original manuscripts, which are in a trunk on the 3rd floor of this house." She paused. "I have been Henry Greville since the first sentence of the 1st volume. Every word is mine." Lord Denton turned to Lady Margot. His voice was distinct enough for every person in the gallery to hear. "I believe you owe the Duchess an apology, Lady Vane." Lady Margot opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked around the room and found no ally, no sympathetic face, nothing but 40 pairs of eyes watching her with the particular attention that follows the moment people realize they have been standing in the presence of a fraud and have only just understood which woman it was. She sat down heavily, then stood again almost immediately, as though the chair itself had rejected her. Her maid appeared in the doorway. Within the hour, her trunk was in a carriage, and the carriage was on the road south, without a backward glance at Ashwell Hall. Charles turned to Beatrix. The room watched. "I have been a fool," he said. "For 7 years I ignored the one person in this house who was keeping it standing. I seated her at the foot of the table. I allowed others to diminish her under my own roof." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. "This estate is hers as much as it is mine, more, and from this day forward, every decision at Ashwell will be made together, or it will not be made at all." Fenton set down the serving tray. Agnes, in the kitchen passage, wept openly. Lady Honoria lifted her glass. Lord and Lady Denton raised theirs. One by one, down the table, 40 glasses rose. Beatrix stood in the candlelight of the gallery her brother-in-law had designed, and her pen had preserved, holding her husband's hand in front of every family of standing in the county, and felt something shift beneath her feet, something steadier than the ground she had walked on for 7 years, something that might, if she let it, hold. The consequences for Lady Margot arrived over the following weeks, delivered in the flat language of social ruin. Lady Denton withdrew her invitation to the summer house party. 3 county families returned Lady Margot's calling cards unopened. Sir Geoffrey Reed wrote to a colleague that Lady Vane had spent 2 years circulating false characterizations of the Duchess's standing, and that her credibility in the county was, in his professional judgment, finished. Her estate agent reported that 2 prospective tenants for the South Fields had withdrawn their offers, preferring a landlord with a less complicated reputation. The woman who had called Beatrix the printer's girl sat alone in the parlour of her increasingly quiet house, and understood that the woman she had dismissed had been, all along, the most important person in the county. By Friday the story had reached London. Every club from White's to Brooks's was discussing it. The Duchess of Ashwell was Henry Greville. She had written 14 novels under a man's name. She had saved her husband's estate with her pen, and the Duke, the quiet Duke, the overlooked Duke of Ashwell, had stood in front of 40 people and said so. That night, when the last guest had gone and the gallery was dark and the servants had retired, Charles found Beatrix in the linen closet on the 3rd floor. She was sitting at her desk. The candle was lit. A blank page lay before her, but her pen was still. She was looking out the window at the orchard, and when he appeared in the doorway she turned, and he saw that her eyes were red. "May I come in?" "It is your house." "It is ours," he said quietly. "You built it as much as George did." She nodded, and he came in, and the room was so small that when he stood beside the desk, his shoulder nearly touched the wall, and the 2 of them were closer together than they had been at any point in 7 years of marriage. "I read all 14, he said. "Every volume." "I know. Fenton told me." He was quiet for a moment, choosing the words. "The first officer in the 3rd novel, the one who repairs the hull at night while the crew sleeps, who keeps the accounts, who never speaks of what he carries." Beatrix looked at him and waited. "That was me." "Yes," she said. "It was always you." "How did you see it? I never spoke to you. I never showed you any of it." Beatrix looked at him. "You did not have to. I watched you every day for 7 years. I watched you walk the estate at dawn when you thought no one was awake. I watched you sit at George's desk and refuse to touch his papers because you were afraid of disturbing something he built. I watched you stand in the conservatory and look at his orange trees with a face you never wore in front of anyone." Her voice was rough, and she let it stay that way. "You did not have to speak to me for me to know you, Charles." It was the first time she had used his name in years. He knelt, a private act, worlds away from any declaration or audience, in a room barely large enough for 2 people, beside a desk stained with 7 years of ink, with a candle guttering in the draught from the window. "I do not deserve what you have done," he said. "Perhaps not, but you are here now, and I would rather have you here late than not at all." She touched his face. Her fingers were ink-stained. They left a faint mark along his jaw, and neither of them cared. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Tell me how to be the husband you should have had from the beginning." "Stay," she said. "Read what I write. Sit beside me at the table and never again pretend that I am not in the room." "I will not." "Then stay." He stayed. In September of that year, the 15th Henry Greville novel was published by Caulfield and Sons. It was the first to carry a new dedication. The words were, "For Charles, who stayed." The book sold 11,000 copies in its first month. Lady Honoria returned to London and told her circle, with the authority of a woman who had predicted the outcome from the beginning, that her nephew had finally come to his senses and that the Duchess of Ashwell was the finest mind in the county. She kept silent about her own tears the night of the assembly, shed alone in her room with the door locked. Agnes knew, because she had brought tea the following morning and found the handkerchief still damp on the nightstand. But Agnes was a woman who understood which truths to keep. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1818, Beatrix gave birth to a daughter in the East Wing bedroom. They named her Eleanor, not after anyone, a new name for a new beginning. Charles held the child in the conservatory doorway while Beatrix slept. The orange trees that George had planted stood in their pots along the wall, unchanged since 1805, and the house that his brother had designed and his wife had saved was quiet and warm and whole. Mr. Fenton retired that winter. On his last evening, Beatrix invited him to supper and seated him at the centre of the table, in the chair that had once been hers, and poured his wine herself. "You always set my place with care," she told him. "Even when it was at the foot, I never forgot." The old steward looked down the table at the Duke and at the Duchess and at Eleanor sleeping in Agnes's arms by the fire, and he pressed his lips together and nodded once, because some things are too large for language, and the only honest answer is silence. Edmund Lange wrote once in 1816 to ask whether his daughter might lend him £40. Beatrix wrote back a single line: "You sold me for 1100. The account is closed." That was his last letter. On the mantelpiece of the linen closet, which Beatrix refused to leave for a larger study because the light was right, there stood a small framed page. It was the first page of the first Henry Greville manuscript, written in a young woman's hand on a February night in 1808, when the house was cold and the marriage was silent, and the only sound was the scratch of a pen that would, in time, save everything. Beneath the frame, in pencil, added later in Charles's hand, were 4 words: "She built this house." And somewhere in a subscription library in Bath, a woman with no knowledge of the name Beatrix Ashwell picked up The Naval Fortunes of Captain Dowell and turned to the dedication page and read the words, "For the house that stands." She did not know the story behind them, but she felt them, the way one feels a door opening in a house that has been closed for a very long time, and she turned to the first chapter, and she began, "If this story stayed with you, subscribe, and I will bring you another one soon."